first of all, I would like to introduce all the active participants. As for myself, I said I'm working at the Kazakh-German University in Almaty. I'm here since September 2017, so a little more than 3 years. And and I'm on the payroll of the Deutsche Akademische Exchange Service, and I'm focusing on security politics more generally, the European Union, NATO, the OSCE, but increasingly also Central Asia. I'm not a traditional, and I think none of the editors is a traditional Central Asia scholar. So that's me. Then we have Jakob Lempp from Hochschule Rhein-Waal. Jakob, you are traditionally an EU integration scholar, you could say, international relations, EU integration. You're a specialist on the Council of the European Union, I should say. Then Alex as well from Hochschule Rhein-Waal, professor of international relations as well. And Alex, you are a foreign policy scholar, US foreign policy. And that's also perhaps sort of, well, I should have added perhaps, because if we talk about the volume, Jakob is to an extent also a comparative politics person. And sometimes I'm teasing Jakob because officially you are an international relations professor, but you're coming from Dresden with Patzelt, comparing political systems. So you, at your heart, you're a comparativist, perhaps. And that explains also a little bit the structure of this book. When we talked about the book, we will do this in a second in greater detail. We decided there will be one part, comparative part, like different political systems, then one part by Alex, like bilateral relations of the Central Asian states with foreign actors, foreign policies of the US, of China, and so forth. So foreign policy analysis, and then one part cooperation, which is my stuff, so to say, as a real international relations scholar, like focusing on questions of cooperation and so forth. So that was the general idea. So I preempted perhaps one answer already. Okay, then we have Rustam Burnashev. Rustam is professor of international relations at the Kazakh-German University as well, with an Uzbek background. You're Uzbek, and of course, exactly the right person to write this chapter about Uzbekistan, together with Irina. Yeah, and I think this is it. Unfortunately, as I said, Serik cannot be with us and cannot make his presentation about his chapter, because this is the general idea that we, for a couple of minutes, perhaps talk about how this book evolved, how this idea popped up, and then really short, casual presentations. And I think we should proceed in the order how the chapters appear in the volume. So Rustam would be first, talking a bit about Uzbekistan, this Uzbekistan chapter, then Jakob with the Kyrgyzstan chapter, which he co-authored with Alexander Wolters from the OSCE Academy, who cannot be, or who was not planned to be here, and then Alex, the United States and Central Asia, and then myself about security cooperation in Central Asia. I mean, we thought about involving more authors of this book. I mean, Aysulu, by the way, who is also in charge of this DKU Talks, she's organizing this event, so thanks to Aysulu. She asked, and other people asked, oh, we can invite this and this person, we could invite Richard and other ones, but then we, Edward Lemon and so forth, but we thought at some point we should restrict ourselves perhaps to this editor DKU Hochschule Rhein-Waal relationship, because given this format, given this Zoom format, we could have invited all authors basically, and we thought this would be going too far. Okay. Then I think this is enough preliminary words. We could perhaps talk a little bit about the book as such, how this book evolved. And now I'm sort of posing questions to myself, but I can pose the questions, of course, to Alex and Jakob. I mean, how did this book evolve? In this preface, there is this anecdote written that Jakob, when he was here, when we were having a beer, like asked me, Sebastian, would you like to join us? And I said yes after one beer. But the question to both of you is, how did you come up with this idea?
Maybe Jakob, you go.
How did it evolve? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to answer that question. And actually, I have to go back quite a lot in time to answer that question. Already in the 1990s, when I studied at the University of Technology in Dresden, and Alex Brandt also studied during the same time, also political science at the University of Dresden. We had a professor, Professor Wolfgang Ismayer, and he was famous. He became really famous for writing books like The Political Systems of Western Europe, and then The Political System of Eastern Europe. And those books, almost every political science student bought those books in the first semester, at least in Germany. And nowadays, this became a whole series of books. Now you can buy books like with the name of The Political System of Southeast Asia and The Political Systems of Latin America, and so on and so on. I thought, why is there no book called The Political Systems of Central Asia? This region of growing importance, however, a region that is not really on top of the agenda for many people living in Germany, for example. So I simply discussed with this editor here, the Springer, and I know some people there, and we were talking about potential projects for such edited volumes and books. And he said, well, I have this whole series in our, we need somebody writing a book called The Political Systems of Central Asia. That, and in that very moment, these thoughts about Wolfgang Ismayer and these old books about the political systems of this and there and this region came to my mind again, and I thought, well, that's a wonderful idea. And so I asked Alex and then also Sebastian to do that jointly, because I think the whole book profited a lot from the fact that the three of us edited this book, and not only one person alone, with a comparative politics perspective or a foreign policy perspective or a regional integration perspective. Also, I thought, and I think that can be really shown in the book, that the book profited from this cooperation between the German Kazakh University and our institution. And that is also something of major importance, because this cooperation is relatively newly established. The DKU had more cooperations with German universities and universities of applied sciences already before we started our cooperation. And this was, of course, the reason why the International Relations Bachelor Study Program at DKU was the only study program at DKU without a double degree cooperation agreement with a German university. And in the context of this cooperation, that was, from my point of view, a huge success, because we were actually able to create such a double degree now, and from, I think, next year or the year after next year, it will be possible for DKU students also to do a double degree in international relations with our university in Germany. So this project, this book, this edited volume, is only one out of several elements of an increasingly close cooperation between the German Kazakh University and Hochschule Rhein-Waal. And so when Alex said yes. I was very happy because Sebastian is completely right. Originally, I'm a comparative politics person studying in political systems. That's also the main focus of my teaching here in Kleve. Although I'm a professor of international relations, but I was very happy that Alex joined because here we have real expertise on international relations. And I was also very happy when Sebastian said yes, because that would, well, add the context of Central Asia. I mean, it's always a very bad idea, and I have never understood how you can really study something that happens thousands of kilometers away without never ever traveling there, without having really experienced how it is to live in Central Asia. This would be really a bad idea to write a book called The Political Systems of Central Asia without having Central Asian expertise on board. And this is why it was so good to have Sebastian with us as in the editorial board, because also he, of course, has these connections in Central Asia, and that is why we have Rustam here as an author and others from the Central Asian context as well. I think this was the story a little bit, but I don't want to steal time from you, Alex, because you also wanted to say something about the trigger, how the whole thing started off.
Okay, so thanks for having me, and it's good to see you, Sebastian, in the end, because literally there were weeks and months when I had more communication with Sebastian than with my wife at home. So I was seeing my wife, but I was talking to Sebastian. So that was sort of my situation. And I'm only beginning to realize that Jakob is the true mastermind behind the book, because he used the same strategy with Sebastian and me in terms of pitching the project to us. It was also when we met in a pub that Jakob informed me about his plan, and he had just returned from the German Kazakh University, and he was very enthusiastic and said, we should have a textbook in German about political systems of Central Asia. And I was listening to that. I was interested, but it would have been pretentious from my side to claim that I had, let's say, an expertise in matters on Central Asia. So I was interested, but I didn't think about me being included here in the first place. So, and when Jakob then talked about the plan, I realized actually that I had been to Almaty 1 year before that moment as part of an accreditation commission. I was there a couple of days in Almaty, beautiful Almaty. It was in November, so that means it was very cold. It was snowy in Almaty, but a beautiful town. And alongside our work as an accreditation commission, I also had the opportunity to talk to colleagues from that university, and I was surprised at that time how big China had become. Right, so I was trying to talk about what do you think, where's the world heading, what are the next big things to look at in international relations, and it was all about China and Belt and Road Initiative, right? And so when I will never forget when I then asked one of those colleagues, and what about Russia and what about the Eurasian Economic Union? And the response was more like, oh yes, that's also there, right? So the Sino-Kazakh relations seem to be really huge, and that was news to me. And I thought about, it's interesting, right? Interesting also to look at Central Asia, how Central Asia is embedded in the neighboring regions and countries. And Jakob still was talking about his project and plan and how beautiful that was. And then I had a second idea. In that same year, I had attended a couple of conferences on entirely different topics. So this was about US pivot to Asia, or how do you conduct research on foreign policy in more closed systems, something like that. And I went through the list of speakers, and it occurred to me that in all those panels, there had been at least one paper on Central Asia, right? So Central Asia seemed to have moved into the center of attention much more, right? And I think it's precisely because of that peculiar location being sandwiched a little bit between Russia and China, neighboring to the likes of Afghanistan and Iran, which makes Central Asia an interesting area. And what I learned where I had a steep learning curve while working on the book is, yes, the external component is interesting and important, but it's also a must and a huge accomplishment to learn about Central Asia in itself, right? So the diversity, the cultural richness, the different political systems and so on and so forth in themselves are very important subject matter to study, not only what happens around Central Asia. So I'm actually very glad to have been asked by Jakob to be on board, because I learned a lot about Central Asia in its capacity as 5 different countries with a rich and diverse culture.
I didn't know about that you've been to Almaty before. That's really news to me. Yeah. And by the way, I've been to Almaty as well many years ago in 2005, I think it was, as an OSCE election observer. So before I came in 2017, I had a clue of what Almaty is about. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that like it's important to get to know the Central Asian states in themselves. However, at the same time, I think we have to mention that this book, we want to sort of distinguish this book deliberately from a lot of literature that is out there that is sort of historical, cultural, from a cultural science historical perspective. So we don't do that, at least in particular. There is one excellent chapter of Stefan Kirmse about how Central Asia evolved as a concept or as a term. I'm not sure if Rustam, Richard read it already. It's really worth reading, but that's the only exception. Otherwise, the chapters are more into political science, I would say, with these subdivisions. Although like looking at the political systems implies, of course, that we take them seriously and that we don't look from a very abstract realist perspective at Central Asia simply as objects of external interventions, but that we take them seriously as subjects as well. But we don't delve into the region, into the 5 countries in this historical cultural science perspective. So we, yeah, so that should be clear. Okay, yeah, then sort of we set the stage a little bit, and I'm not sure if this could be a good opportunity now, at least to share my screen with you. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the book, perhaps to have a short look at the table of contents. I mean, to see. Maybe should I do that? Perhaps shortly.
Try.
Oh no, I don't know why I don't find. Oh, it's here. Yeah. Okay. Wait a second. Here. Okay. So now you should see. Wait a second. Okay, so this is the introduction. This is this chapter I was just talking about from Stefan Kirmse. How could you translate that into English? Concepts of space of Central Asia, if you want, a historical overview. You can see my screen, right? Yeah. And then we have this first part, sort of the Jakob part, die politischen Systeme, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Then we have sort of a second part, which is mixed, miscellaneous themes: transformation, democratization, human rights, corruption, media. And media is also one good example how this project evolved over time. Because I can tell this anecdote as well at this point, when I was sitting with a number of German expats in some pub, and then I was talking about this project, and Ottmara Glas, who is a journalist, a free journalist, was just sitting next to me, and she said, "Oh, I could write a chapter about media in Central Asia." So this is how this evolved, and human rights as well. Anja Mir, when I was at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, I was sharing a room with her, so I thought, well, Anja, so this is, of course, often how books progress, but in this particular case, it was very nice and progressed really over time. So there was no set table of contents, and then we stuck to it, but it really developed over time. Okay, then we have media, civil society, violent conflict, Thorsten Bonacker. Then there is the third part, this Alex part, Russia and Central Asia, China and Central Asia, the EU and the US in Central Asia. And we thought there could have been one chapter perhaps about other actors, because there are several, let's say, medium powers like Turkey, but South Korea as well, Japan, not the usual suspects, but which also strike important bilateral relations with Central Asia. But it was difficult to find someone doing this, but that was an idea at least. And then this last part, this is the Sebastian part, if you want, regional cooperation, with this chapter from myself, which I will introduce a little later. Then Richard, of course, also a very important contribution, cooperation in trade, then cooperation in the environmental sector, cooperation in education, and then kind of outlook into the future by Serik, who, as I said, cannot be with us today. Yeah. So this is the general overview. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I could ask 2 or 3 more questions about how the book evolved, why in German, and so forth, what the responses are. But I think, as I suspected, that that time is moving quickly. We spent 25 minutes already. So perhaps we should start with these mini presentations. And then if there is time later, we can still talk about this in greater detail. There is a broad idea of translating, of doing this volume in English as well, but this is one idea. But I think we should, first of all, have the small presentations. And Rustam, are you okay with being first?
No, of course, why not?
Yeah, okay. Then perhaps just one thing is we could do it in such a way that we do just the 4 presentations one after another and then talk en bloc. But we could also, if there are questions, ask a few questions after each presentation. I would suggest we do it as it develops. I mean, if there are from the audience some people who think, Rustam, we need to ask you urgently, then we can do so. But if there are no questions, we can just wait until the end and then have a major discussion about major things and specific questions about individual presentations. Okay, Rustam, then the floor is yours, and we are very looking forward to it.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you. For me, it was a very interesting project, and I'm glad to be on board of this team, because I think all of us know that even in Russian we don't have some type of book which described some situation, current situation in Central Asia, and connected with all 5 countries and describe all main questions which connected with the region. So for me, it was very interesting. And of course, for me, it was the first and maybe the main challenge to write my chapter was that when we wrote any article, and especially a book, we stay one step behind real situation. And for me, it was very interesting to find some theoretical or maybe methodological background to describe what happened in Uzbekistan and what will be in Uzbekistan in the near future. So I think that I and Irina, we find quite good theoretical basis for our chapter. It's a concept of weak state and weak society, and we think that this concept it's very relative to very appreciated to Uzbekistan, and we really can describe Uzbekistan political and social space as fragmented and as some form of field in which formal and informal institutions and interest groups compare for power and compare for resources and produce some informal orders in form of arbitrary rule. So, for example, when we speak about Uzbek political system, we can say that formally this system based on principle of separation of power and lies between presidential and semi-presidential model. But in fact, the main decision in Uzbekistan are taken on the level of president and his administration. In fact, in Uzbekistan, we have a very strong authoritarian regime with super presidential government. And of course, the second question, which very interesting for us, it's try to describe some features of Uzbekistan development. And Irina and I, we find that there we have three features, such features. It's formation of Uzbek model of transit. It's so named 5 principles of development of country, which was introduced by Islam Karimov. And the second feature is development of idea or ideology of national independence, in which the sustainability of the state and government holds a key place. For us, it's very important point that in Uzbekistan was stressed sustainability of state and government. And the third features is some positioning of Uzbekistan as a regional power, which have some special policy of equidistance from the main centers of power. And again, in this principle, when we discuss this principle, we can see some gap between formal ideas which declare and real ideas. For example, Uzbekistan's authorities say that Uzbekistan wouldn't like to participate in multi-site organization. But in fact, Uzbekistan is a member of Shanghai Organization of Cooperation, of OSCE, and so on. So it's a very interesting position when we have gap between words and things. And of course, we discuss and describe in our chapter some specific question like political culture of Uzbekistan, which we can describe as subject type, and we describe some economic reforms which started in Uzbekistan in Karimov times and which restarted, maybe if you can say it, in Mirziyoyev times, in connected with Mirziyoyev reforms. And of course, for us, we have here some situation of some situation when we can say exactly what happened in Uzbekistan, because even Uzbekistan was named, I think in last year, last year, Uzbekistan was named the city of year in Economist journal. But in reality, we don't sure if this reform was stable, or we will have some situation when Mirziyoyev and his team would like to return to Karimov's authoritarian models. So again, if I return to a theoretical base of our chapter, and we'll speak about again about weak states and weak societies. We again can see in Uzbekistan the very strong example which supports this theory, that in reality we have in Uzbekistan some type of weak state and some type of weak society, and these situations support its authoritarian model and its authoritarian model of development. So I think it's very quickly key ideas of our chapter.
Rustam, many thanks for this talk and for this brief talk, which is important, of course, given the several talks we have. Of course, we saved some time, given that Serik is not with us, which is a general pity, but it saved us some time. But still, brevity is important, of course. Okay, now the question is, are there any immediate questions? I mean, I have one question in mind, but I'm not sure if I should wait and be patient. But perhaps there's some other participants having any immediate question. I think we should have 3 minutes at least for such questions, because then later, after the fourth discussion, many things are lost, and and perhaps yeah. So the floor is open for discussions. Jakob, yeah, please.
Yeah, since Rustam, I have read your chapter already some time ago, and it's some months ago that you finalized it, and so what I would be interested in is how is the recent development in Uzbekistan, and of course it's when you wrote the chapter, and well, you said somehow the path is not yet decided whether Mirziyoyev will be simply Karimov #2, or whether the whole country opens up and is on track to democracy and paradise. How did things develop in the recent months?
Yeah, you know, it's very difficult to say now, because we have a very extraordinary situation with COVID-19, yeah, with these quarantine measures, and of course these measures have some I would say maybe we can describe it for Uzbekistan as some break to reforms. So I think as all other countries, Uzbekistan is closed here itself, yeah, and Mirziyoyev and Uzbekistan and whole must a little bit stopped this reform. And now these reforms, of course, not so intensive or not so strong as there was in last year. But anyway, I can say that Mirziyoyev now something like Karimov #2, of course, because for me, I would like to describe Uzbekistan like it was 1 year ago. So 1 year ago, we have a very optimistic situation, an optimistic point of view about Uzbekistan. And if we accept COVID-19, we will have the same point of view, I think. So we need to see if there will be some changes in next year, I think. And we will have possibility to answer to your question. But now it's the same situation like described in our chapter.
Okay, thanks for posing this question. Rustam, thanks for answering this question. Although, Jakob, we need to be patient, yeah. So nothing important changed, yeah, apparently. Okay, are there more questions to Rustam? Then I'm tempted to ask my question, and basically I have two questions, but the second one is too broad. It's about, in substance, why is Uzbekistan not part of the Eurasian Economic Union? I mean, there are attempts of going into this direction, but I think this question would be too broad. I think we can discuss it later on at the end, because that involves as well the question of what advantages really Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have, because there are discussions in Kazakhstan as well. So I think we should leave this till the end. But the other question that I have can be answered perhaps more quickly. And that is the question which always is going on in my mind about the CSTO, ODKB. Because Uzbekistan joined, I don't have exactly the figures now, joined ODKB at some point, then it left, and then it joined again and left again. So it was a sort of zigzag course. And I had trouble understanding really the reasons. I mean, except for the general argument that under Karimov, and this is what Rustam described very well in this chapter, by the way, this isolationist policy, I don't remember exactly the name, but you put a name for that, equidistance policy, that makes sense. But now Mirziyoyev is already ruling for 4 years, and he could have led Uzbekistan into the CSTO, but he didn't. Are there any more like structural reasons for this, or is it still the legacy of the Karimov period that Uzbekistan still doesn't join the ODKB?
Okay, I think there are no any structural reasons for including Uzbekistan into ODKB or excluding. In Karimov times, it was just question of fear, of course, because the main point was connected with so-named Andijan events. And after Andijan events, Karimov and his regime had very strong fear about international situation, about international pressure on Uzbekistan, and so Uzbekistan was a member of ODKB for, I think, several years. But for me, the question of relationship between Uzbekistan and ODKB is a question of pragmatic, because ODKB it's not union, of course, it's not military union, it's not NATO and something. So, of course, in the ODKB, in the legal base in ODKB, now we have some article which we can interpret like ally relations, but in general, ODKB is some organization for military trade and military training. Actually, yeah, we can very strong example. Last events in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that ODKB wasn't included in this conflict. And Uzbekistan have possibility to solve off their questions which connected with military trainings and military trade on bilateral relations with Russia. So it's okay for Uzbekistan, it's okay for Russia. So there are no any pragmatical reasons for Uzbekistan to be a part of ODKB. It's just practical question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
I think the same question with how to say the trade union. Yeah, Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus. It's the same question. Uzbekistan have a very Uzbekistan had possibility and use this possibility to solve off its trade questions with Russia on bilateral base. So it's Uzbekistan don't have a very strong importance in this organization.
Yeah. So it's a rational move. My microphone is on. Yeah, it's a rational move, simply, sort of. Yeah, yeah. It's not an ideological thing. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Many thanks. Okay, then I think we should move on. Otherwise, we lose too much time. Jakob, the floor is yours.
I did write the chapter on Kyrgyzstan, and I wrote it together with my friend and colleague Alex Wolters, who is the head of the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. And not only that, he lives in Bishkek and he has lived in Kyrgyzstan for several years. I think he's also married to a Kyrgyz woman. So he also has this, he's a political scientist. He knows the theory, but he also has this practical experience. And it was extremely important for me before writing this chapter to actually travel to Kyrgyzstan as well, to also be at least once and at least shortly in the position to do some interviews in Bishkek with several people to understand better also the internal perspective on this political system, and not only from reading the constitution, because as in Uzbekistan, as Rustam just pointed to the situation in Uzbekistan, also in Kyrgyzstan, of course, there is a difference between the constitutional setup and the structure and real politics. However, I would say this gap between constitutional text and the real power structure might be a little smaller in Kyrgyzstan compared to Uzbekistan. And that's also what I would like to start with. If you Google Kyrgyzstan, you quickly come across quite many superlatives, and it's impressive what you learn from simply Googling Kyrgyzstan. You read about an island of democracy in an ocean of authoritarianism. You read about Kyrgyzstan being poor but free. You read about the Switzerland of Central Asia. Well, obviously, some of those statements are exaggerated, and there is some similarity between Switzerland and Kyrgyzstan. Both are small, not many people living there, and there are mountains in both countries. But in terms of the political system, there is also quite a lot of difference between Kyrgyzstan and Switzerland. But I still have to say there is some truth in these statements as well. I mean, we all know these institutions, for example, measuring the degree of freedom and democracy in different countries all over the world. The Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and so on and so on. In all of their indexes measuring the degree of freedom, of freedom of speech, the level of democracy, Kyrgyzstan always ranks top among the 5 Central Asian countries for good reasons. It is classified as at least partly free, partly democratic. It's a hybrid regime in the EIU taxonomy. So there seems to be really a difference between Kyrgyzstan and the other 4 Central Asian countries that are classified as clearly authoritarian, with Turkmenistan as an extreme case, but the other countries, including Uzbekistan, also including Kazakhstan, as examples for authoritarianism as well, according to these taxonomies. So there is a difference. Kyrgyzstan is a special case also in the Central Asian context, and it already took a slightly different path right after it became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what are the elements that already from the beginning pointed to a slightly different direction compared to the other 4 Central Asian states? First of all, if you follow these indexes that I just introduced, it pointed to the direction of it being a little bit more democratic, I would say. I'm not talking about Norway here, but I'm talking about a slightly different path. It developed right from the beginning a multi-party system, which is also different from other Central Asian states that may also have different political parties, but the standard type is basically one political party supporting the president and predominantly being involved in volition and in decision-making procedures in every field of policies. So this multi-party system, we can see that in when we follow the news from recent developments. I mean, Sadir Japarov, he's from a different party than Jeenbekov was, and the Social Democratic Party, who had some strong position in the recent years, broke apart, and actually there is some movement in the party system of Kyrgyzstan that you would also not expect from other Central Asian countries in that way. Also, the formal structure of the political system is, I would say, it is a semi-presidential political system, but in contrast to other formally semi-presidential systems like Uzbekistan, it is, I would almost say it really is. Because of course the president is also in Kyrgyzstan a very powerful figure. Also in comparison, the power relationship between the prime minister, the government on the one hand side, and the president on the other hand side. But I would say this power relationship is a little bit more equal in Kyrgyzstan than it is, for example, in Kazakhstan or in Uzbekistan. So there is some power, some real power in the hands of the government itself, and the link between the parliament and the government is stronger, and the independence of the parliament and the government from the president is a little bit more present in Kyrgyzstan than in the other four Central Asian states. So this is really a difference, the power relationship between government and president, so that we can say that in Kyrgyzstan it makes sense to really classify it as a semi-presidential system. However, I have to add, this will most likely change because Kyrgyzstan has survived several constitutional changes, giving more power to the president, giving a little bit more power to the parliament, to the government. So it has changed over time, and it will change in the near future, because a next reform of the Kyrgyz constitution was proposed by Japarov. There will be a referendum in mid-January, together with the next presidential election that became necessary because the President Jeenbekov has stepped down in the context of these rallies and demonstrations in October. So it will change again, and if you read through the proposed amendments and reforms in the Kyrgyz constitution proposed by Japarov, what is interesting is that he seems to move Kyrgyzstan a little bit into the direction of where the other four Central Asian countries already are, putting more constitutional powers in the hands of the president, and therefore changing the power relationship between government and president to the benefit of the president, which might lead to a situation where we have to classify Kyrgyzstan next year then as a presidential system, which still has a prime minister, but the prime minister then would lose powers. We will see what will happen in January, but the probability is very high that exactly this will happen. We'll all follow the news in January. So another issue that is specific for Kyrgyzstan is that also in Tajikistan this happened, but in Kyrgyzstan we have a relatively high degree of instability as well. There have been phases of violence, of instability. I would also say more so compared to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan. We had this color revolution situation in 2005 with the change from Akayev to Bakiev. We had the horrible situation in 2010 with many people dying for, let's say, two different reasons. First of all, it was this transition from Bakiev to this transitional government by Rosa Otunbayeva, but in the second place, it was this ethnic conflict in the south of Kyrgyzstan with hundreds of people actually dying in this kind of civil war type of a situation for nobody really knows which reasons. That is also something that is strange because so many people died in 2010 in Osh and Jalalabad in the south of Kyrgyzstan. And to really find out what is it that triggered that horrible situation is extremely difficult. There are plenty of explanations, and none of them seem to be really 100% convincing to me. So I didn't get the point, and I talked with many people from Kyrgyzstan. And it seems to me that also they somehow seem to not get the point here. But this proves that this is not a stable situation there. And of course, we have seen, we have all followed the news in October in Kyrgyzstan. This is not over yet. However, all of those events and the institutions, that's important. But in that chapter, we also try to focus on some structural problems of this country. And we have identified three that seem to be of major importance. First of all, of course, this latent instability due to ethnic divides, maybe. I mean, the clashes in 2010 were mainly clashes between ethnic Uzbeks and ethnic Kyrgyz people in Osh and Jalalabad. It is a multinational country, Kyrgyzstan, and it seemed to be, it seems to be still present in this society. On the other hand, this latent instability can also be is also very present in the political system, in the party system. The frequent constitutional changes, the frequent changes and overthrows of the president, of the head of government. We had more presidents in Kyrgyzstan than in almost more than in all the other Central Asian countries combined. We had definitely more prime ministers in Kyrgyzstan than in all the other Central Asian countries combined. And we have observed the breaking apart of the relatively powerful and influential Social Democratic Party in Kyrgyzstan. Due to this rivalry between Atambayev and Jeenbekov already in the recent years, and that's what we have in the chapter already. And this is the root cause for the situation in October this year and the clashes that we have seen in Bishkek. The second structural field of problems, I would say, is that points more to the international relations part of it. Is the still unclear border situation, especially between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, but also between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. One of the largest European Union mission outside the European Union is exactly this border management mission where police forces and army people from different EU member states actually try to solve that issue in Kyrgyzstan. And it's a very complex picture here because, of course, it's about the enclaves and exclaves, the very difficult situation. Kyrgyzstan, the country with worldwide the most enclaves and exclaves of all states in the world. And that, of course, results in difficult situations. And every year we have border clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, with actually people dying at the border because the border is not clearly defined. That's one of the projects of this EU BOMKA border management mission. But of course, it is also about land surveying. It's also about drug trafficking from Afghanistan, and it involves many different policy areas. And I also think that this is something that needs to be resolved before there is more hope for stability here. And the last of those structural issues, problems, is the divide of the country, I have to say, between North and South. Of course, there is this multi-ethnic situation, but we find that in many Central Asian countries. So I'm not necessarily talking about Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz people. I'm talking about this North-South divide. If you travel across the country, it seems like the mountains are not only a geographic barrier between the south, Osh and Jalalabad, and the north with Bishkek, but it's also a cultural divide somehow, with people being a little bit more religiously minded in the south, a little less so in the north, with a situation where important public offices are, well, there is a competition between southerners and northerners for important public offices in Bishkek. So this is also something that is well, a potential source for future conflict. Well, I think I've talked enough, and of course the recent events, the election in 2020 in October, we couldn't cover that topic in the book. We didn't really foresee what would happen after this election. Beimenbetov stepped down, Japarov was freed from prison, and 1 or 2 or 3 days later he found himself to be the prime minister, and then also the president of Kyrgyzstan. So this is really a development that surprised us on the one hand side, but on the other hand side, it was clear from this latent instability in the country, in the political system, from the breaking apart of the Social Democratic Party, from the North-South divide, that something like this could always happen, and it did happen. And we'll see what happens in January when there will be the next presidential election. My forecast is that Japarov will be the next Kyrgyz president. Well, there will be a reform of the Kyrgyz constitution, but it's too early, of course, to judge that once and for all. We'll see.
Jakob, many thanks for your talk. I particularly liked your neat message about, like in between your talk about Kyrgyzstan apparently moving up or down, depending on your perspective, towards the regime types of the other 4 Central Asian states. And I didn't like that politically, but from an academic perspective, I found that a neat message. Yeah, okay, so many thanks for your talk. And now again, are there any immediate questions, short questions, with supposedly short answers? Otherwise, longer questions with longer answers should be postponed till the end, perhaps. Although we don't have too much time left, 2 presentations still. But yeah, so the floor is open for short questions.
I would have one.
Oh, go on,
kind of short one. I know you said you can't forecast what will happen in January. Well, nobody can. But what's for me the biggest question right now, I wrote a lot about the events in Kyrgyzstan in October, like a lot of articles. I talked to a lot of activists. And with the constitutional reform ahead, I was wondering, what's your assessment? What do you think? How do the people react to this? Do you also think if there's the referendum, then they will kind of falsify the result, and that will cause another, let's call it revolution, or what, I don't know what kind of other terms there are right now. So I'm just curious about your assessment. What do you think? How do people react if Japarov will win, and if there actually is the constitutional reform accepted?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the future, but I, of course, can try to talk a little bit about the future, and whether I'm wrong or right will be will be seen in January. My forecast is that he will win by relatively large margins. Why do I think that? I think so because he plays this nationalist card a little bit. He became famous, Japarov, for his fight against the, was it Canadian or I think Canadian company exploiting Kyrgyz soil and taking oil in the Kumtor mine and all that. This was where the context within which he became well known to many. He also has supporters in the south and in the north, so he may be able to overcome this north-south divide that I was talking about a little bit earlier. He was, I mean, he got political socialization of Chaparov. Chaparov was in this Bakiev era. He was a close supporter of Bakiev back then. And somehow, well, when Bakiev fell, he survived. That might show that he also has a strategic outlook a little bit. My forecast is that he will win this election, that he will push through this constitutional reform, and which will mean in the end that he will be a more powerful president than Jeenbekov was before. Which again leads me to the assumption that Kyrgyzstan will look a little bit more like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the other Central Asian states in comparison to what it was before. How do I mean, evaluate that? There is something good about it, and there is something bad about it. The good thing about it is that this may create a more stable situation in Kyrgyzstan in the long run, but of course it may reduce the Freedom House index numbers for Kyrgyzstan in the near future. And this is my forecast. I don't know, Otmara, when you wrote a lot about this kind of unrest revolution in yes. October. So I would be also interested in your view and how you would assess, for example, also the readiness of Jeenbekov to step down. I mean, he could have tried to stay in office, so this was also a movement towards de-escalating the situation a little bit. How would you judge the situation?
Well, very short, Sebastian.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like for Jeenbekov, I think I was kind of surprised because it was really contradicting what he said in the beginning. He really said, I want to stay in power, I'm not stepping back. But then at the same time, he was hiding. So he just disappeared at one point after the people went into the White House. And then nobody knew where he was. And he had this video messages where he was talking to his people, but still he kind of disappeared. And I think that was a mistake. I can understand it from one side because I also talked with people here in Kazakhstan and they also were like, well, it's a security issue. So you don't know what would happen to him if we just have openly spoken to the people. Maybe they would have attacked him, especially those people supporting Chaparov, who appeared very aggressive at all the meetings and protests. So from a human point of view, you can understand that he disappeared and hid somewhere. But so in the end, I think he was kind of forced to step down. And also what we don't know, there are those rumors that Chaparov has those connections to the criminal world. He was sitting in the prison. So probably he got to know with people there who are also kind of powerful. And maybe they had something in their hands against Chaparov. And for January, I really don't know how to assess this constitutional referendum. I would agree with you if it will happen and if there's a majority for the changes. then it will go to a more authoritarian state, because Japarov will then have much more power than Chernykh or even Atambayev. But on the other hand, I also think, like what you already said, in 2010, there died so many people while fighting and protesting for a constitutional change to get a system more democratic. And I'm just wondering, like, if the people are just so tired of everything what happened in the past 10 years. We had this rather democratic system in comparison with all the other states, but nothing really changed. They were the same clans and structures as always. Just on paper, it looked more democratic. But will they just forget all those people who died in 2010 and they, okay, it's like that, and let's see. So I'm really curious what will happen. I also can't foresee, of course. I don't know the future. That's my assessment.
Okay, many thanks for a smart question. Good answer. Very interesting discussion. I have a very small question concerning the kind of threshold in the parliament, in the Kyrgyz parliament. As far as I'm not really an expert on that. This is you, Jakob. But as far as I'm informed, at some point, the threshold has been kind of lowered from 7% to 3%. And we as Germans, I always keep teaching that my students when I teach politics of the European Union, the politics of Germany, the 5% threshold in the German parliament, which is a source of stability, that many really small parties cannot enter the parliament, so that coalition building is easier. My question is, my twofold question is, I mean, why has this threshold been lowered in the first place, and what implications does it have from 7 to 3%? I think that's still now 3%, right? If I'm not.
In addition to that, it's even more complicated because in addition to the nationwide threshold, there is a regional threshold. Within the districts, every party has to reach a certain threshold on the regional level as well. So even if you get over the national threshold, you might not find yourself in the national parliament due to these regional thresholds. This was originally, I thought that this would be a smart idea because this would prevent the party system in Kyrgyzstan from being defined primarily through ethnic or regional, a regional or ethnic dimension rather than other cleavages. And this, of course, especially in Kyrgyzstan, would constitute a huge danger. So therefore, I thought that this would be that this was a very smart and intelligent and good idea for the electoral system in Kyrgyzstan. However, and that is also very different from the other Central Asian countries, there have always been quite many political parties represented in the I don't actually know how to pronounce the Yogorku Kenesh or something. So the national parliament. I don't speak Kyrgyz, but that in the national parliament with 6 or even more political parties being present there. So even this relatively high threshold did not lead to a small number of political parties because there was no single party dominating everything. And there were 6 parties with relatively equal support all over, well, not all over the country, but with relatively equal support, so they could jump over that 7% threshold as well. Some of them being founded newly, and some of them being basically the supporters of a kind of oligarch. Some of them being defined through ideology rather, the Social Democratic Party, which then again broke apart recently, some supporting Atambayev, some supporting Jane-Bekov. So I think that this lowering the threshold wouldn't make such a big difference. in theory, you would expect that, but since there were relatively many political parties present in the Kyrgyz National Parliament already before, with changing coalitions also, I would expect no major changes due to that in that specific case.
Jakob, many thanks. Very interesting things we are discussing. But I'm afraid we need to move forward because we have about 17 minutes left. Yeah. So it's a sign that this is a very interesting theme. These are very interesting themes. And yeah, now we move up the ladder of abstraction, so to say, because we now had two presentations about two select Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And of course, we don't have time for everything, but at least select examples. And now we move to one instance of bilateral relations or of foreign intervention, if you want, or non-intervention. That will be, I think, one of the messages of Alex in his talk about the United States and Central Asia. And then with my talk, final talk, yeah, we will even move a little bit further up the ladder of abstraction and then talk about security cooperation briefly in Central Asia. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I try to be brief. And I mean, if you look at the question of external actors in Central Asia, you could ask yourself from the very beginning, but why the US? I mean, the US is perhaps the outside power which is truly offshore, far away. And I would largely agree that as neighboring countries, China and Russia are the far more obvious candidates for a discussion. And even the EU is closer in terms of location distance. So why the US? And I think there is at least three reasons for looking at the position of the United States, or the relationship of the United States, or the non-relationship of the United States towards Central Asia. First is, the United States has had and continues to have the potential to act as a global superpower, right, in terms of power projection. So whenever the United States chooses or decides to pursue interests in faraway places, it has the power and the capacity to do so. And that still sets the United States apart from other actors which might be powerful or might be emerging powers or something like that, that the United States, if it had interests and if it choose to pursue interests in faraway places, it could do so. The second reason is that at least since the early 1990s, the US took selective interest in Central Asia, in different sub-areas, sub-regions, different countries at different points of time, and for different reasons, right? So we've seen that the United States at times has been there in Central Asia and has forged, let's say, close relationships with a couple of governments, but in different places at different times, very, very selective. And third, I would say, on a general level, if you look at the world map, you could claim that because of that particular geostrategic position of Central Asia, close to Russia and China, but also its proximity to Afghanistan, the endowment with resources, right? You could claim that it should be an area which is of interest to the United States, or so have claimed a couple of thinkers, a couple of policy analysts from within the US political system, that Central Asia actually should occupy a central stage in strategic thinking of the United States. So what I did in the first half of the chapter is that I tried to order things and events, and I came up with a, let's say, periodization, where you could say the US engagement in Central Asia could be divided into three periods. In the first period, largely the 1990s, Central Asia pretty much boiled down to Kazakhstan, right? So US was very much interested in getting the Kazakh government on the table to discuss the issue of denuclearization. And in fact, when that happened and when that was successful, Kazakhstan in US policy circles was, let's say, framed or labeled a poster child case of successful cooperation in denuclearization and the prevention of let's say, nuclear proliferation, right? So but there was not so much attention towards other countries in the Central Asian area. That was pretty much focused on Kazakhstan. That changed after 9/11 and the global war on terror, where you had a shift towards Uzbekistan and towards Kyrgyzstan as frontline states in the global war on terror, and that had, of course, a lot to do with the military bases and the use of military bases and power projection through K2 and Manas, right? So suddenly, I would say, places which were known in the US only to experts became important hubs in the global war on terror, which was US-led. And then you could say, starting in 2005, 2006, a third period began, and I would claim we are still in that period, where we are still in that phase, which you could label a sort of a retreat or only lukewarm engagement of the US in the region. And the turning point here, of course, was the crisis or the events in Andijan, which Rustam already alluded to. And I think for the first time in the history of US engagement in Central Asia, even in the US Congress, there were hearings and debates and so on and so forth about the situation in Central Asia. And there was a general sentiment rising in terms of, but these are repressive places and hotbeds of corruption, and we shouldn't throw money on them, even though they might fulfill a strategic purpose, right? So this was sort of a game changer in the US political system. And even though you couldn't claim that the US has completely retreated, I also would say that the strategies that we have, so the United States has a Central Asia strategy. It's a policy document which is renewed, I think, every 4 to 5 years, has a Central Asia strategy, but it's not really a lived document or a living document. It's not a counter proposal or a vision which inspires much enthusiasm. It's more like a routine task to have a Central Asia strategy. And the case in point here is, if you compare, I already mentioned the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and then all the rage in many different regions along the different belts and roads. If you compare that to the United States 2011 New Silk Road Initiative, I mean, who knows that? Who knows the New Silk Road Initiative of the United States, right? But they also had a plan of, let's say, connectivity and economic prosperity and corridors, and that would have touched Central Asia as well, but it never really got traction. It was announced in Chennai by Hillary Clinton, never really got off the ground, and was sidelined early on by the Chinese plan, right? And then it was the Chinese and Belt and Road and the US plan basically forgotten. So I think this, let's say, yes, it's there in terms of we think about Central Asia, but we don't make it a priority area, a focus area, and we don't put a lot of efforts into nurturing closer contacts. I think this is a condition of US foreign policy since around about 2005, 2006. In the second part of the chapter, I discussed a couple of policy areas which are usually deemed of importance in bilateral relations in general and in US foreign policy in particular. So that is among them diplomacy, for instance, or economic interactions and resources. And I only want to share two impressions because it's very interesting. If you look beneath the surface, sometimes you find things which are a little bit unexpected or surprising even, right? So in terms of diplomacy, I think Central Asia is one of the few regions of the world which still waits for a US president to pay the region an official visit, right? So such symbolic politics is, I don't think it's trivial, right? Especially from the position of a region which expects a high-level political visit from a president from an eminent country, right? That matters, but we have a certain asymmetry here, right? Almost 24 high-level visits of several presidents, state leaders from Central Asia to the US, And the US from time to time keeps sending, I think the most high-level official from the US side has been the Secretary of States, the respective Secretary of States. And the latest example, of course, Mike Pompeo touring Kazakhstan this summer only, right? So a couple of months ago, right? So there is that sort of asymmetry and mismatch at the level, I would say, of symbolic politics and appreciation. It's a sign of appreciation and a sign of assigned importance if US presidents pay a visit to a region or not. And I think that asymmetry is telling. The second point is, if you approach things more from a political economy perspective, post-Marxist sort of thing, I think you would expect that the whole issue of economic resources plays a much bigger role in the US engagement in the region of Central Asia. Right? So the common assumption, I think, is that US companies are heavily invested there and that the US perceives the whole region or pockets of the region as being very resource rich and therefore of primary geostrategic importance. And if you compare that with the balance sheet of activities, it's interesting that the United States, in its official policies, pursued, let's say, slightly different strategies since the 1990s. The two top priorities were not so much getting access to oil and gas or pushing US companies there. It was weakening the very strong dominant Russian position. Diversification for the purpose of weakening the strong dominant Russian position, accepting that the Chinese would step in, right? So it was no problem in the 1990s, and I would say up until around 10 years ago, that the Chinese became ever more important in the regional resource markets, if only that undermined the dominant Russian position. From nowadays perspective, I think the game has changed a little bit, but now the Chinese are there, right? So, but it's interesting to see that the US was not too keen on let's say, pushing US companies there themselves, but diversification. The second top priority, keeping Iran out of the game, right? So you see, this is not so much about a collusion of political and economic interests, it's rather a political agenda via economic means. And if you look at the US investment in the Central Asian resource sector, I think you could say they have a very strong performance in the Kazakh resource market, but for instance, not so in the Turkmen resource market, right? Because Turkmenistan also took all measures to keep the US out, of it, and had a clear preference for the Chinese, right? So what I will end up with is that at the moment, at least if you compare the situation to other external actors, the US remains pretty much on the sidelines, and to a large extent, that's also a result of the own choices and prioritizations of the US, right? So occasionally you have an articulated interest, but that never has been matched with enough resources, activities, or appreciation for Central Asia. And if you would press me to make a forecast, I don't think that this will change dramatically under Joe Biden, because he has a whole different set of list of priorities, things he need to address, things he needs to pay attention to. I don't think that Central Asia stands a high chance of moving dramatically up in the list of priorities in the next 4 years. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Alex, many thanks for your talk. And yeah, we have 4 minutes. I count on you that we do a little bit longer to be able to listen to my short presentation. But still, are there any questions, short questions to Alex's presentation so far? I mean, I'm tempted to ask, and perhaps I can to speed up. Do you think, because you mentioned this US Silk Road initiative of, I don't know, 2011 or what it was, and the only thing that I heard about this initiative, it's of course a question of simply the size, like the money spent, and that might explain partially why it has not been so so much publicized. But what I have heard is that under this label of connectivity, what the US does in a nutshell, in a substance, is not like fostering infrastructure projects as such, but rather financing sort of assessments of existing infrastructure projects. I mean, maybe that's something different. Maybe we are talking about different things, but this is what I've heard, that sort of the United States says to several beneficiaries of Silk Road, of Belt and Road funds, hey guys, Mongolia, whatever, you are thinking of taking a loan from China. We, under our program, we take a closer look at the contracts you're signing, if you're interested in that, so that you make the right decision, so to say. That might be something different still, not what you have in mind, but this is what I heard. And the European Union goes a little bit in a similar direction, because it has also this connectivity strategy, where the European Union does want to cooperate with China, but at the same time sort of comes up with an own connectivity strategy where transparency and and sustainability, things like that, in many different terms, feature higher on the agenda. So the question would be to what extent there would be sort of prospects for cooperation between the European Union on the one hand and the United States on the other, in sort of softly countering like the Chinese Silk and Belt and Road strategy. But that's perhaps, yeah, also question like requiring a full-fledged answer, but perhaps you can try if you think you can answer this question, to give a try.
I will try again. I will also try to be brief. I think what has been set in motion is let's say a little bit of a competitive game that the other external actors try to seize on the opportunity of the first cracks and fissures in the Sino-Central Asian relationship, or in the cooperation projects between China and several Central Asian countries, so that there is a little bit of unease and disagreements and the contracts not being paid respect to and something like that. And in that situation, the other actors launch sort of through the back door, let's say, alternative conceptions, or look, you could have a different, we help you to also have a different look, or to develop a different perspective on matters. So this is a competitive game which might have set in motion. And as you mentioned, I think the European Union is much clearer about that. The latest Central Asia strategy of the European Union is all about connectivity and trying to position connectivity in a different light. So connectivity, but not the Chinese way, right? So I think we need to see what is acceptable and feasible in different Central Asian regions, different Central Asian countries, in terms of an ability and a willingness to also choose, right? Or to play external actors off against one another. I just want to come back with one sentence to that initiative from 2011, which I think was a little bit different in terms of, I think it was not so much geared towards the Chinese efforts. It was an own plan, but it was much smaller in terms of the financial resources, much vaguer in terms of what actually should happen. Was more like a declaration of goodwill, and we should do something together, and wouldn't it be nice? And I think what made it a little bit less appealing compared to the Chinese proposal is that the US also, at least let's say between the lines and in the paragraphs down the document, also had talked about issues like rule of law and strengthening democracy and civil society, which is completely absent in the Chinese plan, right? So I think it was much less financed, much vaguer, and contained the threat or the danger of a hidden democratization. And I think that basically meant it was a stillborn idea.
Okay, Alex, thanks for your answer. And now I'm looking in the chat, and I think Otmara, an alle, or is this to Alex? Will Central Asia become more important to the US when it focuses more on China? Yeah, that's an Alex question, of course.
Yes,
Will
yes.
Central Asia become more important to the US? Or alle is simply that the visibility in the chat. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so Alex.
So my point is that now also with Joe Biden, he's a very he's a guy who's still from the old bipolar system, and he already said in one of his speeches, the biggest enemy for him is Russia. So I'm just wondering if there will be a president who focuses rather on China than on Russia, if that will change anything connected in the US foreign policy to Central Asia.
If I had to predict something, I would say this will be one area where we will see a lot of continuity, even from let's say the Trump era to the Biden era, in terms of, I think China will still be on the list of contenders and those actors with whom the US, let's say, will have a rather mixed or cold relationship, in terms of they see China, and Biden clearly sees China. Team Biden sees China, needs to see China as a contender, competitor, and a country which needs to be challenged and contained. So it won't be a comeback of the Clinton years of we basically do things together and everything will be fine and together we rule the world. I think there will be an element of contestation towards China in the Biden strategy as well. The question is just perhaps a little bit different style, less disruptive, perhaps also less threatening occasionally, and there won't be that peculiar mix of blaming China while at the same time being good friends with autocratic leaders. I don't think that this will continue, right? That will change. But by and large, China will be in the camp of those, let's say, countries which the United States needs to contain. One strategy now could be to focus on neighboring countries, adjacent areas, and try to contain China's influence there. And then Central Asia would be a candidate region. I don't think so, because that would require that the United States invests a lot, and that is not only, let's say, sending Joe Biden for an official visit, but invests a lot. And I think it will focus on areas and will focus on let's say, potential Chinese allies in its orbit, which are not from Central Asia. I think they will rather seek to contain the rise of China in that area where China just made a huge partnership agreement, trade partnership agreement, right? So they will not revive the TPP, but they will seek to build on the remnants of TPP. And I think they will put their priorities there. They will not go through Central Asia. That would be my prediction, because it would mean to first establish much more of a relationship than the United States has in comparable places where it could also, let's say, rein in or contain China. That would be my prediction. I don't think, because it didn't happen even in the Trump years, that Central Asia moved up in terms of attention and let's say being a focus area, even when it was an openly declared policy towards the very end of the Trump administration to contain China's rise, and if needed also with military means, right? So I don't think that these positions Central Asia as a more, let's say, attractive or reasonable cooperation partner that will to contain China, but the containment policy will stand, I think.
Okay, Alex, many thanks, and Otmara for this question. Yeah, I think we need to move on because we are over time already, and I hope you still have a few minutes for the last talk, because this will be my own talk. Yeah, and again, as I said, we are moving up the ladder of abstraction a little bit from bilateral relations to sort of regional relations. And my chapter, which I'm trying to introduce in a nutshell, is the first one, if you remember this table of contents from this last part, where we look the general idea in this book was to look at different policy fields, because there is a lot of literature on Central Asia about cooperation and integration of Central Asia. Sometimes cooperation and integration are lumped together, but actually they're not the same. I mean, integration is basically a very far-reaching form of cooperation. So this is sometimes, and then also it is often in the literature that you sort of lump policy fields together, trying to talk in general. Cooperation in Central Asia doesn't go so far. And there are partially separating policy fields as well. But the general idea for this book part was to separate policy fields and to look at how far cooperation goes in different policy areas. And of course, I mean, this volume, this edited volume is not like research, new basic research. It's more a depiction of the existing literature that is out there. But of course, in the future, it would be a good project to look, a research project, to look in greater detail and to look through a common lens with a taxonomy, or to look at different policy fields in greater detail. We have here security, the environment, trade, and education. There might be additional 2 or 3 additional policy fields. So that's the general idea. And my chapter is about security cooperation in Central Asia. And I think I'm the only one having a short presentation slides, and which I'm now trying. You can see everything. Okay. So because I gave this talk as an individual DKU talk already, so this is a shortened version, and I will further shorten it because of our lack of time, 5 minutes or so. And the general point, I go a little bit over starting in the 1990s, after the independence of the 5 Central Asian countries, where they made a couple of attempts at regional security initiatives. There was, in the second half of the 1990s, the Central Asian Peace Battalion, for example, which survived only a couple of years. In 1996, several of the Central Asian states signed the Treaty of Eternal Friendship, envisioning security policy coordination and comprehensive cooperation, including the clarification of border issues. In 1999, all Central Asian states but Turkmenistan negotiated an agreement to establish a Central Asian regional security system. So a number of examples of security, regional Central Asian security initiatives, but none of them really survived a long time. None of them was really filled with substance. And against this backdrop, one scholar, Roy Ellison, talked about these attempts, about cooperation attempts more generally, about pseudo-regionalism. Yeah, so a lot of talk, but not much substance. And Beate Eschment in 2009, talking about cooperation efforts in general, quote, I translated this from German here, too many, too high, and too abstract goals. So a lot of initiatives, largely fed by Kazakhstan, having pretty much in the driving seat, while Uzbekistan in particular, the second possible leader in terms of size of the population, like jump-starting such projects, was not really on the scene, given Karimov's isolationist foreign policy and regional policy. So Kazakhstan was pretty much the initiator of many of these initiatives, such as the Central Asian Peace Battalion, which then, after it had been dissolved, fed into a unilateral initiative, the Kazakh Peace Battalion. So absent independent regional security initiatives coming to fruition, the Central Asian states, and this has been mentioned several times already today in the other talks, have come to largely rely on external security providers, above all Russia and China, but also other external security providers, the OSCE, the European Union, but also individual states, Turkey, the US, India as well. So using larger institutional frameworks going beyond the region. I mean, the idea of a regional security system or of regional security cooperation would imply that only the 5 Central Asian states exclusively would build their institutional structures, build their own, let's say, Central Asian security organization. That would be sort of what is often described as regionalism, yeah, in the comparative regionalism literature. But what eventually evolved short of these exclusive initiatives is reliance of the Central Asian states largely on institutional structures going beyond the region, first, and second, not involving in many cases all the Central Asian states. I mentioned the ODKB, CSTO, of which Uzbekistan is not a case. So the Central Asian states, some of the Central Asian states largely relied on the CST and later the CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which to an extent induced also regional cooperation, given certain institutional moves like exchange of information, coordination of security policies. But again, these are institutional structures going beyond the region, involving Russia, involving China, involving Armenia. So it is not really a genuine, exclusive regional security system or regime, if you want, that evolved over time. Yeah, and that's my main message that I'm trying to make, and I don't want to go very long given the shortage of time, but the message and perhaps an attempt to explain that. I think 2 really explanations stand out, and if you look from a rational choice perspective, looking really at what sort of advantages the Central Asian states would have if they cooperate. First of all, of course, the usual suspect, the usual explanation is the foreign policies are too different. They are too much focused on keeping their sovereignty. That wouldn't explain, of course, why many Central Asian states deliberately are members of larger frameworks. But one like rational explanation is probably that there is no real advantage stemming from sort of building a security system of their own, given that security mechanisms exist already, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, such as the CSTO, where several Central Asian states, particularly striking bilateral relations with Russia in particular, can gain benefits that they couldn't gain otherwise if they would craft their own regional security structures. And one example is, of course, being able to import military goods below market prices from Russia, for example, which is a huge benefit, of course, but also simply having a security shield from Russia, to an extent playing China and Russia off against one another, being part of several security mechanisms. And these are benefits that the Central Asian states could not reap if they would simply craft an exclusive regional security system in which they would have to invest a lot of effort, not only financial means, but also simply coordination. To craft an institution anew from scratch is, of course, a very time-consuming thing. So that explains partially why no genuine exclusive security mechanism in Central Asia evolved. And a second explanation is probably that there is no clear sort of hegemon, clear leader, regional leader. There are two sort of candidates. Kazakhstan, in terms of economic resources, by far the richest Central Asian country, and Uzbekistan on the other hand, with 34 million inhabitants, by far the most populous Central Asian state. So there is a sort of competition between these two Central Asian states. And against the backdrop of this theory of hegemonic stability, arguing that there should be in one given region one and no more than one regional leader sort of going forward, and that was the case with Kazakhstan, I think, clearly in the 1990s, but for several reasons, Uzbekistan was completely out, given this unilateral isolationist foreign policy, not to talk about Turkmenistan. So that didn't really come to fruition. And now that the foreign policy of Mirziyoyev is more sort of open, more towards regional cooperation, then really you have a second potential leader on the scene. That sort of leads to a implicit competition between these two states, and that might be a second major reason why the prospects for genuine, exclusive cooperation in the security realm are not very bright. Of course, we would have to talk about other cases, about other fields. I mentioned that in the beginning. There are cases in the trade field where the Central Asian states have gone much further. It might be simply because the pressure, because the benefits, potential benefits from cooperation are much clearer than in the security field. That might be an explanation. But I think there is a lot of research to be done on this, to have a look at this area of cooperation in Central Asia, looking at different policy fields. And this is just an attempt at pointing out some developments and the one attempt to come up with some hunches regarding explanations of this, in the security field at least, relatively low degree of cooperation. And I think I'll stop here, and we have almost, we are close to 2 hours. But still I stopped my screen, and perhaps there are still a couple of questions about my talk, or questions about more general questions across all talks might also be.
May I start, Sebastian?
Yeah, you may start.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for these interesting insights. Sebastian, I want to pick up on your question on why this volume has been published in German language. So Professor Burnashev said that there aren't any comparable books in Russian language. So are there any plans to publish or to translate this into English, or maybe even publish an updated version in English in a couple of years from now to attract a wider audience?
Yeah, I mean, this is a general question, right? To all of us, more or less. Yeah. I mean, we have thought about this, and I think really this combination of having first an English version that would enjoy a wider audience, but also an updated version. I think that these two things would make a good marriage. Yeah. Even if we would start right away, we have to convince all authors, and I think even in the contract details of Springer, there are some paras telling that authors have to agree if there is a new version. I'm not sure if that applies to translations as well, but I'm sure that all the authors would like this idea. Yeah, but even if we would start right away, I think that would take 2 years or a year and a half or so until an English version would be published. I think we can think about that in the middle of next year, end of next year, after we have seen, you know, the responses. I think the responses are pretty good in Germany. I mean, Alex mentioned all these social media mentionings. I'm not at Facebook, so I'm a little bit old-fashioned, but I think there is the response is quite large concerning this book. But I think perhaps after summer break next year, we could approach, or shortly before summer break, approaching our authors with this idea to translate this book into German and into English, and perhaps also with slightly longer chapters, because the chapters are really short. And if we would ask the authors to update a little bit and add a little bit detail, the merits of an English version could also be, if this is possible with 23 chapters, to have slightly longer chapters. To answer your question in a nutshell, yes, we are thinking about that, but we haven't discussed this in detail, really.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe I can add, we should probably first wait for the planned reviews about this book. We have, I think, 2 or maybe even 3 more than less prominent people convinced to write the reviews about this this German version of the book, and after that I totally agree. We should proceed with an English version of this. Of course, the first step then is, after having talked with the authors, to talk with Jan Treibel, from Springer. Because well, maybe we even get support from the editor in the process of translation.
But you think that there will be a market for it?
Yes, definitely.
I think so too. I think so too. And I mean, one additional idea is also, I mean, I think the number of chapters is also already quite large with this German version. But we might think of perhaps adding perhaps 1 to 3 chapters. And one chapter that comes to my mind is the one that I mentioned earlier in this bilateral relations part, for which Alex is responsible. I mean, what I have in mind is perhaps a chapter, sort of a residual category of sort of bilateral relations with Central Asian states, where we can sort of, that's a bit negative, but perhaps lump together a number of external actors, such as Japan, such as Turkey, such as Korea. South Korea is definitely an important
Iran, probably.
player. Iran, perhaps. So I think it would be too much if we would have individual chapters for each of these actors. I mean, if we have Turkey, South Korea, Japan, I mean, then we would have 5, 6 more chapters. But perhaps one chapter where we could talk about these actors, that would be an idea. And perhaps, I don't know, 1 or 2 other chapters. I mean, Irina wanted to write initially about extremism, which didn't materialize. I mean, maybe something like that, which is not really necessary, but would be nice, of course. And depending on the size, we would allocate it for such an English version. We might also think about adding 1, 2, perhaps even 3 more chapters. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the outlook. Seems reasonable to me.
Yeah. And then also one related question is, I'm really not 100% sure, but I think, I mean, Palgrave is I'm talking about Palgrave Springer, is of course a huge company, and they surely do have their English-spoken outlets.
They do.
But I'm still sometimes irritated. There is, I mean, Palgrave. No, it's not Palgrave, but there is St. Martin's Press sometimes, which is the English outlet for German. So I'm not really sure about that. But there is
a consortium. There's a consortium. Springer and Palgrave Macmillan basically join forces and cater to different markets.
Okay, yeah. So there is definitely a possibility, and that might ease like copyrights, because copyright is always an issue. I mean, and if this is in-house, if copyrights are transferred sort of in-house, then of course an English volume would also be easier to craft than if we would ask if this is a completely different company. So we should really think in this direction, but I think yeah, would be a good idea, and also it's an appealing idea in as much as 1/4 of the chapters have been drafted in English anyway. I mean, if they should be updated, of course, you know, thematically they have to be updated concerning their content. But at least there would be, for some authors, there would be English chapters already in a substance. So yeah, I think that's a very appealing idea. Yeah.